Now we're going to begin looking at the central nervous system, which I remind you is the brain and spinal cord. Uh, Before we get to either one of those specifically, however, we're going to look at the protective connective tissue that covers the surface of the brain and spinal cord. And there are three layers, and collectively they are known as the meninges. And so what we're going to do is take a look at a frontal view. So this would be like your patient standing right in front of you, and we're taking some sort of a film. And there's the brain, and there's a dip between the right and left hemispheres. And then the brain comes down, and there's a bulge there that's called the brain stem. And then the spinal cord and the skull, by the way, there's an opening in the skull for the spinal cord to go through, and it's the biggest hole in the bottom of the skull. Does anybody remember what that big skull hole is called? It's called the foramen magnum. They were trying to make it easy when they were naming it. In fact, foramen magnum means big hole. But remember, they were doing it in Latin at the time, and so we're having to learn it in a different language. But foramen just means hole. Magnum means big, big hole. And that hole is fine for fitting the spinal cord through. However, the brain stem will not fit through. If you try to push the brain stem down through that little hole, it will basically short it out. And why is that important? Because it's in the very bottom part of the brain stem here, called the medulla, that our respiratory center is located. So we are interested in anything that will increase pressure up here inside the skull, because if it does, that's called increased intracranial pressure, and we're going to come back to that. But when that happens, it's going to push that medulla down into the foramen magnum and short it out, and your patient will quit breathing, and that's pretty much all she wrote. So let's look at the three layers of the meninges. The outermost layer is called the dura mater, D-U-R-A. It has a lot of blood vessels in it, and there is an area up here at the top called the sinus where the dura basically uh, is going to route blood returning from the brain that's already been through the brain. So this would be venous blood, blood that is the oxygen pulled out, and it's sending it back to the heart to get reoxygenated. And by the way, bleeding inside the brain uses the dura as a landmark. If it is above that, it's called an epidural hematoma, and anything below that is a subdural hematoma. Both of which can potentially be life-threatening because they're going to increase pressure up here. If I bump my elbow really bad and my elbow starts to swell, there's plenty of room for my elbow to swell. It may be uncomfortable, it may be unsightly, but it's certainly not life-threatening, just the mere fact that my elbow is swelling. But anything like that up in the skull is life-threatening because it's always going to tend to push the brainstem down into the foramen magnum. Next layer is the arachnoid mater, and right beneath that we have the cerebrospinal fluid flowing. The cerebrospinal fluid has a number of functions. It helps distribute hormones and things. It also cushions the brain so that when you shake your head from side to side, your brain does not bounce off your skull like a bell clapper, dong, dong, dong. If it does, by the way, your skull slams against the skull. That's called, your brain slams against the skull. It's called a concussion. And we know that these are cumulative, which is very unfortunate for somebody like me that was into both football and martial arts and got his bell rung repeatedly when I was younger. But so far, it hasn't affected me at all, so I'm lucky about that. And so far, it has not affected me at all. So, I'm lucky. Because when I was younger, I got my bell rung repeatedly. But so far, it hasn't affected me at all. Probably. Another thing that it does is reduce the brain weight by 97%. If you've ever been in a lake or a swimming pool or the ocean, and you cradled somebody in your arms. You can cradle somebody that normally, if you were standing up, you could not cradle them. For example, uh, as a child, you might could cradle one of your parents, whereas on dry land, you couldn't walk around with them in your arms or anything like that, but you can in the water because, of course, the water, um, the surface tension of the water is basically taking a lot of that off. And you already have about 20 pound, you've got like a 20-pound bowling ball worth of weight that is basically being suspended by your cervical vertebra. So anything you can do to reduce that weight is really dandy, I'm sure, as far as your cervical vertebrae are concerned. And finally, the innermost layer of the meninges is the pia, and it is attached actually so tightly to the brain and spinal cord that if you tried to separate it, you would end up tearing the surface of the brain and the spinal cord, and gosh, that would just ruin your whole day. It's also highly vascular, and the way that and for some reason, it's just the way that things people remember these things is DAP, DAP. That'll take you from the outside to the inside. Dura arachnoid pia, DAP, Dura arachnoid pia. I also thought that I would, in addition to talking about intracranial pressure, tell you about two common injections in this area around the meninges. We'll start with a spinal tap. Now, one of the things that can go wrong up here is called meningitis. Itis means inflammation of, right? So this is inflammation of the meninges. And what are we worried about? Well, of course, as they become inflamed and they begin to swell, what's that going to do? Increase the pressure up here inside the skull and tend to push the brainstem down into the foramen magnum. So that is, of course, bad. Now, there are different, what would make me suspect somebody had meningitis? Well, if you've got a headache and you shake your head and it just becomes blindingly bad, that is a good reason to at least have this checked, because there are different types of meningitis. There is viral meningitis, but there's also bacterial meningitis, and bacterial meningitis can kill you in like 24 hours flat. So it's really important to know if the meningitis is bacterial or not, and one of the things that you can do is something called a spinal tap. And in a spinal tap, you're basically going to insert a needle through two different layers, the dura and the arachnoid, two different layers of meninges to get to the cerebrospinal fluid. Right? You cannot get a sample of cerebrospinal fluid without penetrating the outer two meninges. So I've actually seen that on a nursing exam, by the way. How many layers of meninges do you have to penetrate to get a cerebrospinal sample? Well, the answer would be two, because it flows between the pia and arachnoid. Okay, and the other injection that you're probably familiar with, or at least most of you have heard, is an epidural. And if you are familiar with this, then you have probably heard it in relationship to delivery of a baby, called parturition, as far as it would be stage 2 of parturition, which was the actual delivery of the baby. And you're going to do this during stage 1, which is the labor stage, is when you give the epidural. Now, notice that epi means around, just like if you got an epidural hematoma, it's on the outside of the dura. Well, an epidural is given on the outside of the meninges. Your spinal cord actually ends at L1. L1 is pretty high up on your back. It's like, let's see if I can get my back here, like right here, which is probably, I'm guessing, a lot higher than most of you thought, because I'm sure you thought that it probably went all the way down to your rear end or something like that. That is not the case. Your spinal cord ends way up there. So you give an epidural a couple of vertebrae down just to make sure that you don't hit the spinal cord. Now, there are spinal nerves down there. There's actually a bunch that come off of the spinal cord on both sides called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail because it kind of looks like a horse's tail. But you're not actually anywhere near the spinal cord itself, and you're certainly on the outside of the dura. And yes, what you have heard is true, that if you wait too long for the epidural, you cannot receive the epidural. So make up your mind ahead of time. talk to some people, talk to your OB-GYN, and get your game plan going so that you don't wait too late, if that is the way that you want to go. Since we were talking about the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid, I wanted to also show you that you have pockets inside the brain filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and these pockets are called ventricles. So you've got an outer cushioning on the outside of the brain, and then you've got these pockets inside the brain. There's four of them actually. The first and second ventricles are within the cerebral hemispheres. And you know what? We haven't gone over the parts of the brain yet. Like I can tell you, the third is down in the diencephalon area, but you don't know about the hypothalamus yet or anything. Or between the pons and the cerebellum, there's the fourth. But anyway, there's four of these, and they're inside the brain, and they're filled with cerebrospinal fluids. And that's the important thing, that you've got cushioning on the inside of the brain and the outside of the brain to try to mitigate, if not outright prevent, concussions from head trauma.